Okay, let's jump right in. We're going to tackle a question that seems simple on the surface, but has honestly stumped thinkers for centuries. What is literature? I mean, it feels like we should all know the answer, but the closer you look, the more it kind of slips through your fingers. So, before we really get into the weeds, just pause for a second. How would you define it? Right now, what do you think are the essential ingredients that take a bunch of words on a page and turn them into literature, with a capital L? All right, got something in mind? Good, because we are going to treat this whole thing like a detective story. We're going to line up the usual suspects, put them under the spotlight, and see if we can finally crack this case. Okay, let's bring in our first suspect. Now, this is the one that most people, probably you included, would point to first. The most common starting point is this. Literature is basically just made-up stuff. You know, fiction. Novels, poems, plays, anything that isn't factually, literally true. And it sounds pretty solid at first, right? A story about a wizard? Literature. A biology textbook? Not so much. But this definition falls apart really fast. Just look at the evidence. We consider tons of factual writing to be incredible literature. Think of Francis Bacon's essays, or John Donne's powerful sermons. And on the flip side, you've got a whole mountain of fiction, like Superman comics or romance novels, that most people wouldn't classify as literature in that high art sense. So yeah, it's pretty clear that just saying literature is fiction doesn't work. The line is just way too fuzzy. It leaves out stuff we want in and lets in stuff we usually keep out. So, for suspect number 1, case dismissed. Let's move on to the next one. Now, our second suspect is a bit more academic. This idea comes from a really influential group called the Russian formalists. Their whole thing was that literature uses language in a special way. They called it an organized violence committed on ordinary speech. What a phrase! Basically, it means literature twists, bends, and intensifies language to make us see the world differently. And you know it when you hear it, don't you? When you read a line like this from a poem by Keats, it just doesn't sound like ordinary conversation. It is absolutely not the same as hearing someone say the drivers are on strike. Literary language, this theory goes, calls attention to itself. But as cool as this idea is, it's got some serious problems. First off, what even is normal language? The way I talk isn't the way you talk, isn't the way someone across the world talks. There's no single standard. And of course, language changes. A totally normal sentence from the 1400s might sound incredibly strange and poetic to us now, just because it's old. And finally, what about slang? Slang is definitely not normal speech, but you wouldn't call it literature, would you? Okay, on to suspect number 3. Maybe literature is writing that doesn't do anything practical. You know, you don't read a novel to get directions or learn how to fix your sink. You read it for its own sake. It's not a means to an end. The experience of reading is the end. But here's the fatal flaw with that idea. It shifts the definition away from the writing itself and puts it all on the reader. Think about it. You could decide to read a bus schedule, not to catch a bus, but to reflect on the beautiful rhythmic patterns of modern life. Does that act of reading suddenly transform the schedule into a piece of literature? It gets tricky fast. So, we've gone through our main suspects, and none of their stories are holding up. It feels like we've hit a dead end. But this is the moment in every detective story where the big plot twist happens. I want you to just let that sink in for a second. This is from a major critic named Terry Eagleton. And what he's saying is that our whole investigation, our entire hunt for a single defining feature of literature, has been a wild goose chase, because that single essence, it doesn't exist. So if it's not one thing, then what on earth is it? Well, literature isn't an objective thing like an insect, something you can pin to a board and classify. It's a construct. It's a label that we, as a society, decide to give to certain kinds of writing that we think are valuable. And this is the important part. Those decisions, those value judgments, are always shaped by our social beliefs and our ideologies. This means that the literary canon, that famous list of great books everyone is supposed to read, it's not some timeless truth handed down from the heavens. It's a tradition that was built by specific people in specific times for specific reasons. And because it's built, it can be changed. It does change. Okay, so if literature is a construct, a category we invent, how do we even begin to study it? Well, even if the territory isn't fixed, we can still draw maps to help us navigate. Let's take a look at how that works. One of the most common maps is just a simple timeline.
We group works of literature into historical periods: Old English, the Renaissance, modernism, and so on. This lets us see how the writing from a certain era shares common styles or worries or ideas. But a map isn't enough for a real investigation. You also need the right tools.
So, once we have our evidence organized on the map, we need our toolkit to actually analyze it. In literary studies, these tools are called critical theories, but it's easier to think of them as different investigative lenses. Each lens you look through shows you something totally new about the text. Broadly speaking, you can break these lenses down into 4 main approaches. Some focus only on the text itself, the words on the page. Others are interested in the author's life and psychology. A third approach looks at the reader and their experience. And finally, the one we're about to explore focuses on the context, the social and historical world surrounding the text. Let's make this real. Take a classic book like Gulliver's Travels. If we put on a post-colonial lens, we're suddenly not just reading a funny adventure story. We're asking critical questions about power, about empire, and about how the story shows the relationship between the powerful colonizer and the people being colonized. Okay, now let's swap that out for a psychoanalytic lens. All of a sudden, the same exact book becomes a map of the human subconscious. Those weird creatures Gulliver meets, they're not just characters anymore. They're symbols for our deepest, most primal desires and anxieties. And let's switch one more time. Put on a feminist lens. Now our focus snaps to how gender works in the story. We start asking, how is power tied to being male or female in these different societies? Who gets to have power and who doesn't? You see? Same book, 3 completely different investigations, just by changing the lens. So, we've interrogated the suspects, we've had the big plot twist, and we've looked through the tools in the critic's toolkit. So what's the final verdict? What is literature? And here's the final reveal. Maybe the point was never to find one single answer. Maybe the real value is in getting better at asking the questions. The goal isn't to define literature, but to learn how to interpret the world, to ask smarter, deeper questions about the stories we tell ourselves, and to understand why those stories have such a profound hold on us. The case, as it turns out, is meant to remain open.